Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, talking about the new Blumhouse horror film, Night Swim. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. Well, before we start, let me just say Happy New Year. I hope you guys all had just a great New Year's Day celebration and a fantastic Christmas. I know I did, but I'm ready to get back into just talking about films. And I know January typically tends to be somewhat of a dumping ground for movies, studios, just sort of, after like, the big spectacle and scope of sort of the Christmas movie season. A lot of January movies, quite frankly, just aren't very good. But every now and then you do get one of these sort of early year films that find some traction, become sort of like a surprise breakout success. And last year, Blumhouse Studios, their sort of similar horror film, Megan, was one of those films. It was actually a film, despite not necessarily being a huge horror guy myself, it was one of my probably favorite films of the year. I really enjoyed it. And it does seem like Blumhouse is trying to kind of capture lightning in a bottle twice with Night Swim, which is a very similar type of movie, a PG-13 kind of more mild horror movie, kind of thriller that centers in on just like a very kind of universal, like base level fear, in this case, of sort of the water and of drowning. Unfortunately, despite what I think is a promising premise that does have a lot of potential for scares and the traction gained through Megan, Night Swim just really kind of from start to finish fails to make very much of a ripple. So this film, the movie itself, if you're not familiar with it, it centers in on sort of like a family of new homeowners who quickly discover that the backyard pool of their newly bought in house has a sinister past and a lot more kind of going on beneath the surface. And it is a film that is clearly trying to capitalize just on that base level fear of drowning, as well as this sort of additionally the anxiety that I think every parent has when you have kids and you have a backyard pool and them falling in, them not being supervised. Personally, I am a big fan of these types of movies that center in on like a very isolated, singular location and like kind of build the tension from like, the smaller scope. Although I think with Night Swim, despite sort of some of those promising elements, the movie itself just proves to be a little bit too simplistic to be able to maintain kind of interest for the duration of the entire runtime. And this is a movie that began first as a kind of a successful short film, like I think, like a 10-minute film. And I think, at least to me, it quickly becomes evident that the filmmakers are laboring to stretch sort of that more contained, concentrated terror into like a full-length film. Because for about the first 2/3 of this movie, it does fall into a almost very like repetitive cycle where like a family member falls into the murky water and then they start seeing some like unclear and unexplainable sights and find themselves flailing, trying not to drown before emerging from the water, kind of unsure with what they saw. And this sort of that cycle repeats over and over with various of the family members. And the film just doesn't seem able to establish this any kind of sense of like escalating tension, like to keep the momentum going from one of those encounters to the next. And eventually, like in the movie's final kind of climactic act, it does sort of pull back the curtain and begin to reveal like a bigger scope and kind of build more of that kind of escalating, building tension and anxiety. But it's a little bit too little too late. And although I think some of these later kind of revelations and scenes do work effectively like as horror elements, and it definitely is seems like it's the most effective as far as like horror and scares go in kind of in the third act of this, narratively a lot of the stuff that happens seems almost oddly disconnected sort of from the previously established narrative. And probably the biggest strike going against this movie is simply that it's not very scary. The PG-13 rating does mean that like some of like the shock value horror tropes are absent in this movie. I think kind of similar to Megan last year. Kind of, it is a more relatively mild horror movie that doesn't have a lot of just sort of desensitizing blood or gore, just trying to jar audiences. And as someone that isn't a huge horror person, I was thankful for that. I don't think the problem is not the PG-13 rating. I think the bigger problem is just that the kind of the horror elements that it does lean into instead of just sort of the shock value just aren't all that effective. And this film never seems able to kind of capitalize on just that suffocating anxiety that we all have from the fear of drowning, and even like kind of the creatures and the spiritual elements and going on in this are just never all that scary. Like in a lot of ways, they almost come across like a bit hokey and like silly, rather than being terrifying. And perhaps the best way to describe it is just that kind of from start to finish, I was always very keenly aware that I was watching a horror movie unfold rather than just sort of that edge of your seat, sort of breathless immersion like in the action as it's happening. Although I will say maybe it's more positive for this film is that it arguably works better as like a family drama than it does a horror movie. Because unlike a lot of horror movies that seems to just sort of introduce a bunch of paper thin characters just to be fodder to be killed or terrorized by whatever the creature or spiritual entity in the film is, this movie centers in on a single family, and each member of this family is believable. This is a kind of an imperfect and yet very loving family, and I found myself, I cared about all of the characters in this, even as I found sort of the unfolding action around them not overly compelling. As far as content to consider, kind of things going on the surface of this, there's really not a whole lot, especially for a horror movie. Language, there's a handful, maybe 5, 6, 7 of kind of more minor profanities. And then I think God is used on 2 or 3 occasions as well. There's also a character who's talking to a cat and refers to the cat as a pussy, and there's very clear like double meaning in that phrase, but there's no F words or anything like that in this film. For sexuality, really nothing going on here as well. This is a movie centered on a swimming pool, so you do see several characters wearing swimsuits, and maybe like the most explicit of that is there is a scene of a character that's swimming underwater, and the camera does seem to almost kind of linger on like the backside of this character, but really overall nothing that was as overly gratuitous as far as sexuality goes. As far as violence, again, like I said, there's almost a surprising lack of blood or like on-screen violence in this movie. A lot of the death and like horrific elements in this film kind of occur off-screen, or they're just alluded to. Like there is a young girl that ultimately drowns, and later you do sort of see her corpse or like her body as well as a bunch of other corpses, although the implication is that these are like spiritual manifestations and not like the physical dead body of these characters. And there are also just sort of some like frightening visuals, like some characters have like a tar-like water substance that oozes out of their eyes and their mouths. This is intended to be kind of frightening. Again, it's not necessarily violence. Maybe just a few other kind of content things. There is a character that kind of muses about, gives a little speech about how humans evolved out of the water, and that's why we sort of subconsciously feel like we shouldn't go back to the water. Kind of on the other side of that, there's also a character that is clearly like a professing Christian, and he invites one of the main characters to join like a Christian swim team, and some of the other characters talk about the fact that he's a Christian, and for the most part he seems like he's a decent guy, although he is in one scene like he's swimming at night with his girlfriend in the pool without her parents' sort of knowledge that he's there, although he himself does not seem to be aware that there's a problem with that, and nothing nefarious happens in that encounter. And then just the pool itself is kind of described as having some sort of spiritual powers, as sort of this like magical wishing well that kind of, in the past people must have worshipped or, prayed to, although it's never kind of clearly explained what exactly this, where these powers come from. As far as themes go, things going on beneath the surface of this, probably the main theme that this film explores is just kind of the nature of love and sacrifice. Ray, who's the father of this family, is a former professional baseball player whose career had been cut short due to illness and some medical conditions. And kind of as he attempts to like reestablish his a new life for him and his family, it's very clear that he's still clinging to sort of the past and to the dreams that he has had before. And as his condition worsens, his doctor encourages him that, hey, it's going to require great sacrifice, but him and his wife can kind of forge a new life together. And on multiple occasions, a character straight up says, love requires sacrifice. And in many ways, Night Swim is sort of an exploration of that statement. And Christians can definitely affirm the notion that love requires sacrifice, but kind of the manner in which that sacrifice is understood in the film, at least initially, is almost like an inverted gospel or biblical conception of sacrifice. Again, without wading too deep into spoiler territory for this film, there is sort of a mechanic that in order for a boon to be granted to one of the characters, it requires sacrifice to be had by another character. And it is this example of a very selfish love that requires sort of other people to pay the price on our behalf. And the pool is sort of described as like being able to grant the deepest wishes for people, and becomes almost like a metaphor for these characters sort of sinking deeper and deeper into their own kind of grief and selfish desires, and this losing sight of kind of the needs of the people around them. And obviously the Bible offers a very different understanding of love and sacrifice, like John 15:13, which says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Or even just in a larger spiritual sense, just the example of Christ kind of offering himself as a sacrifice, and a demonstration of true love. And ultimately, kind of at the end of this film, the characters have grown in that understanding and do come to reflect kind of closer to a Christ-like understanding of what love looks like and sacrificing on behalf of others. So I think in the end, despite a very promising premise, and I think this potential to tug on those very universal, relatable fears of drowning, Nightstrom just comes across a little too tame and just stretched too far to offer anything beyond just a very shallow kind of entertainment. I don't think it's an awful movie. I think it does have some good elements. I did enjoy the actual characters in this story, but it just has nothing to offer to elevate it beyond just sort of a movie dumped at the first week of January. But hey, let me know what you guys think. If you guys check out this movie, if you're a horror fan, if you're just looking for something exciting to go see at the start of the year, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So jump in the comment section and let's have a conversation about this. And hey, if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, get lots of movie reviews and podcasts and just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.